He has decades and decades of experience fighting for human rights and fighting for reconciliation between conflict peoples. He is currently a public policy scholar at the Wilson Center, and prior to that has served as director at the University of Maryland Center for International Development and Conflict Management, and also as director of the Truman Institute for the Advancement of Peace at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He's the author of some 20 books, 70 articles on a range of topics on human rights and conflict resolution studies, and he currently teaches as well at the University of Maryland College Park and at the Interdisciplinary Center in Herzliya, Israel. Eddie is here through a generous grant from the Henry Luce Foundation to bring scholars who are studying issues of religion in international affairs. And Eddie's topic could not be more relevant in that context. His project, while he's here at the Wilson Center, has been on the role of diasporas in protracted conflicts, Arabs and Jews in Latin America, and the Israeli-Palestinian issue. And I'm sure Eddie will give you a lot of background. As we know, there have been significant waves of emigration from the Middle East to Latin America by both Jews and Arabs, and those populations oftentimes absorb the politics and contribute to the politics in their home countries, sometimes in positive and sometimes in negative ways. So without further ado, Eddie, thank you.
Thank you very much, Cindy, to you personally and also to the Latin American program and the Middle East program for hosting me. I've been also blessed by two directors that have been also helping us with our research. I say our because I'm working with a wonderful team of young people that are seated here to my right. Janine, Hanif, and Luciana have been working on the different languages that are relevant to this conflict. So it includes Farsi and Arabic and Spanish and Hebrew. So we have all the language skills, and I hope you will be judging if we also have the research skills that are leading to a subject that seems to be very wide in terms of the scope, talking about a continent. We are talking about actually 18 Latin American countries. We are not going to dwell on Cuba because, Cuba cut relations with Israel very early, although I've written about Cuba separately. But also Haiti, we don't have enough information. But all Latin American countries, the Spanish-speaking and Brazil, we have covered as best as we can in our research. We have collected a lot of material, perhaps enough for a monograph of 100 pages. But we are going to sum it up in 25 slides. We are leaving a few slides just in case we'll be asked specific questions we anticipate. And the first part will be more methodological. I promise Cindy will be very brief. And then we'll go more into the Jewish and Arab communities, the diasporas, a little bit about the Israeli and the Arab and the Iranian policies in Latin America that are obviously impacting the Arab and Jewish communities in this continent. And then we'll try to compare the centrality of the conflict for both Arabs and Jews in Latin America and end with some preliminary conclusions. This slide is like a little bit of symbolism of what we would like to present. Here you have in Buenos Aires two streets that are crossing with each other. And obviously they are going in two different directions, if you see, which represents very much what's happening in the Middle East. State of Israel going in one direction and Palestine going in the other direction, unfortunately. But it has also many other additional symbolisms. For instance, I should say Estado de Israel is an avenue and Palestine is a small side street. And also Estado means state, and Palestine hasn't got yet the word state. So it reflects, paradoxically, it will be the reality of the Middle East. But if I could have used Photoshop, I don't really know how to do that, I would have put the arrow of Palestine going up and the arrow of Israel going down. And that will be reflecting more the reality of what the mood is, at least I would say in Latin America, perhaps elsewhere too, but definitely when it comes to the popularity of Palestine going up and the popularity of Israel going down, in sort of generalizing. So if we look into the major research questions, this field has been very much into what Benedict Anderson has been saying, has been calling long-distance nationalism. Long-distance nationalism, the assumption is that diasporas tend to be more extreme than people living the daily conflict, and we want to check that to see if it's true or not true when it comes to our case study. The second question does more specifically deal with an issue that has not been addressed, which is a comparative way to try to see how a conflict affects two communities living side by side in another country other than the home country. And that's where we probably are going to innovate most. And whether one is more proactive than the other, is one affecting the other, are the Jews and the Arabs competitive when it comes to their work for their homeland and so on. And the last question is something that in the social sciences we call action research, which is we try to manipulate one variable to see if the situation can change. Obviously, people would like to see diasporas to be more, as it was mentioned in the previous slide, peace builders rather than peace breakers. And as I say, the general assumption is that they tend to act more as peace breakers, so more nationalist, more extreme. So a question we are posing, the last question is, what does it take if I want to go into policy relevant? And I ask the question, what does it take for a diaspora community to help to peace rather than to undermine peace? What are the necessary? I think we are a little bit innovating in the overall literature of diaspora and conflict. As you see, the term diaspora has been used. So in many pieces of work we have seen, it has replaced the name of migrant community into diaspora. Everything seems to be diaspora now. It's kind of a trendy word. Used to be attributed only to the Jews originally, but now, it's kind of universal. But we want to put it in the right place. So when we look into migrant communities, which is what we are talking about, so one of the researchers, Yossi Shine, who is not far from here in George Washington, coined this good differentiation between being here and being there. Namely, being here means that you are already in the country that you opted to leave, and being there, you are still, your mind is in the homeland where you come from. And we are talking about diasporas are more related to being there than to being here. That is very clear to us. So we have to go firstly to this arrow. And then there are two types of diasporas. The ones that became diasporas by voluntary exodus, and the diasporas that became so through some violence that occurred in the country of origin. Obviously, when there is a violent situation in the home country, the involvement is much more emotional than there is just out of voluntary immigration. And finally, we have placed our study in a diaspora that is not into regime change, like the Libyan diaspora, to give an example, but we are unfortunately in a conflict of people versus people. This is not a regime that originally Palestinians wanted to change or Jews wanted to change. We're talking about a conflict that was perceived for quite a while to be zero-sum, of one nation replacing the other nation, definitely a protracted, long conflict. And that's why we call it ethnopolitical, because it has to do with a particular identity attribute that makes these Arabs and Jews different, obviously. So that's where we are placing it. And I'm moving very fast with the methodology, but the next one is giving you the frame or the matrix of what we are researching. The most important thing for us, as you can see, the size, is the Jewish diaspora and the Arab diaspora. That's what we really want to put the emphasis. But we know that we need to link that both to the homeland and to the host country. You see the arrows. They are all over the place, the arrows. But the one that we are particularly interested, and it is highlighted, is the arrow that is connecting the two diasporas. And on that, I think we are doing some inroads, because most of the work done on diaspora and conflict has been a single diaspora related to the home country. Whereas here we are taking two diasporas relating to a conflict in their respective home country. And I think that this arrow has a lot of insights and maybe opportunities to transform from peace breakers to peacemakers or peace builders. And that's what we are putting. And also, in general, most people have been interested to see how diaspora affects, let's say, negatively the conflict in the home country. But we also want to understand how the conflict in the Holy Land is affecting the well-being of the Arab and Jewish communities in Latin America, which is unusual. Normally, people are more interested to see the other arrow. So it's quite a challenge what we have. And for doing a comparative analysis of two diasporas, we really have to be as systematic as possible. As you can see, we have taken three types of issues. One is like historical, chronological, then what do they do for the homeland, or vice versa, functional, and then the connectivity. Is the diaspora connected only with the homeland? In the case of the Jewish community is very interested, maybe connected continentally. We have people here from American Jewish Committee, just to give an example, not by accident, and so on. So we have these three areas of comparison. We try to be as strict as possible in the comparison, which is in a way very useful, because I'm moving to the next one. The comparative analysis is moving away from what has been, in the case of Jews, diaspora in Israel, very kind of stressing the uniqueness of the case. And, each case is unique. And of course, when you come talk about diaspora and all diaspora, first diaspora, Jewish, and so on, there's a lot of uniqueness there. But we believe that by putting things in comparative perspective, you can understand, firstly, better the issue of centrality. How central is Israel or Palestine? And in a comparative perspective, over time, you can see also change over time. So that's why we are into two communities that are related to one, if you want, Holy Land. And that's what we're doing. We have found a lot of hypotheses that are relevant to diaspora and conflict. In fact, in the first listing, we listed 41 hypotheses, which is, it's a wealth of things to prove. We narrow it to 17, which is the ones that we really want to check. And we have a slide with the approximation to some of them that we're not going to show, but if people will be more interested on the theoretical part again, we have an extra slide waiting for such question. But we're also trying to generate new hypotheses. I mean, just to give an example, this question of mutual sense of victimhood. I mean, we do have it in both sides at different periods, Holocaust, Nakba, the 48 exodus of the Palestinians, and is very interested, as well as stateless and state. This is a very interesting comparison. Israel is now a state. Palestinians are only still stateless. What does it mean in terms of a comparative analysis? So all this is really enriching our methodology, and I move quite fast, as I promised, to introducing now the Jewish population in Latin America. And as you see, the figures are pretty accurate. We are focusing on figures that are provided by a very distinguished demographer called Sergio de la Pergola. And if you want to understand what he defines as Jew, it's always a big question mark, what is a Jew? But he has decided for demographic purposes on a formula. And Luciana, that has been working with me from day one, even before day one, she's now the expert on this topic, and she will be able to explain it if you want. But in any event, if we look at the bottom line of this table, we have a reduction of the Jewish community in Latin America, mostly in South America, not so much in Central America, but Central America is only perhaps 15% of the 10 to 15% of the overall population of Jews in Latin America. We have a great reduction in Argentina, in particular, 35% less, and I believe that since 2009 it could be even more so. And then overall, South America is 28%. Now, we don't have the exact figures, but we can say that maybe about 100,000 of this original 460, 500,000, let's say, about 100,000 came to live to Israel. I'm one of them, by the way. So we have about quite a large number that went to Israel. But the numbers are decreasing, and there are more now going to the U.S., than to Israel. I was in Uruguay only a few weeks ago, and I was confirmed by the heads of the Jewish community there that the attraction of the U.S. is so much higher for the young people than Israel, in spite of Israel having a much more full employment than the U.S., and in spite that Israel is offering so many more conditions for absorption, like, language training and then work training and many other facilities. Things are changing quite a little bit, and we are already saying that Miami is the gateway for Latin American Jews. I don't even want to talk about Jews like a country like Venezuela, where the situation is also a push situation rather than a pull situation. Half of the Jewish community is no longer living in Venezuela. Most of them are living in Florida. Perhaps a place called Aventura has more Jews now than Caracas, in a way. So that's the reality. So it's a changing reality, and we want to understand why is that happening. Now, when we go into the history of the Jewish immigration to Latin America, there's an extraordinary amount of research about Jews in general and Jews in Latin America. So there's no point even to try to innovate. Just for general knowledge, we're going to come up with some issues that are more relevant to the question of diaspora and conflict. I would say that from a very beginning of organized emigration to Latin America, there was some competitive approach. There were two philanthropists, one, the Baron de Rothschild, who wanted the Jews to come to Palestine and to be productive, and, wineries and so on. And there was another philanthropist called Baron Hirsch. Around the same time in history, he thought about the Jews becoming the gauchos of South America, perhaps in Argentina, settling there and having agricultural colonies. So there were two barons with two schemes, one Zionist one, aiming at, and the other one a diaspora one, running away from pogroms and persecution into a paradise called Argentina, with little population at that time. So we have these organizations that are pushing in the two directions, like brothers saying goodbye to each other, one going to Palestine and one going to Argentina from Russia or Poland. But also interesting, the Zionist parties that became the Zionist parties in Israel, from the extreme left, like a Marxist Zionist party, up to the extreme right, what's called the Revisionist Party. The same parties were the parties that organized the Jewish communal life in South America, where there were the largest communities, Uruguay, Chile, Argentina, Brazil. They were organized by Zionist parties. So in a way, the original connection between Israel and the diaspora in South America was very strong. In other words, diaspora in Latin America was very Zionist. Very Zionist. And that's why it's not surprising that so many Jews left Latin America, mostly because of the pull of Israel rather than the push out at the beginning, because they wanted to go to the kibbutz, build a new society. And by the way, a large number of Jews from our Latin American origin still live in kibbutz in Israel that has gone into a capitalist phase of incredible magnitude, but the Latin American Jews were still very much related to that. So there's a lot to say about that. And I would say the strong Zionist feeling of Jews in Latin America came to a peak by 1975, where there was this difficult to swallow resolution of the UN that Zionism is racism. And of course, it took them personally because they were Zionists. It's not something that only the Israelis felt, but Jews in the diaspora felt very strongly, and in Latin America as well. So we have this, and since then, it has been going down. I'd like to relate to that a little bit later. I mean, the Zionism has been going down, and even if there were some incidents that reminded the Jews that are connected to Israel, as you see in the 1990s, there have been two terrible bombing attacks in Argentina. One at the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires, and 2 years later at the main office of the Jewish community in Buenos Aires, AMIA, which connects, you see, this question of Jew and Israel. Or if you want to put it in Spanish, it sounds even more dramatic, Israeli and Israelita. I mean, for an interesting reason, which I can comment later on if you want, Jews in Latin America stopped to be called Judíos by their own wish, and they became Israelitas. And then comes Israel. That was before, by the way, before the State of Israel. And the State of Israel could have been called many names. The one name was Judea, by the way, but eventually was opted for Israel. And here we have most of the Latin Americans, I would say, that are not highly educated, confuse the term Israeli with Israelita. They don't understand the differences of being a citizen of Israel or being a Jew in Latin America. So the connection between Israel is not and the Jews is not only done by the Jews, but also by the non-Jews who perceive that to be part of the same, community, which is so interesting. But these have been changing, and eventually, after the attacks and so on, we are now talking about an expression which probably is controversial. Diasporism is replacing Zionism in Latin America. And I think that it's a very important comment for Israel to know that the attraction of Israel is much less than the attraction of a country like the U.S. or even Spain originally, not now because of the situation and so on. Now we have a next slide that is giving you a great detail about the contribution of the Jews in Latin America to their homeland, to Zionism, to Israel. And over the years, it has been very important. At the beginning, I wrote with a colleague a book called Israel-Latin American Relations many years ago, and there were no Israeli embassies. There were only honorary consuls that were local Jews who did a wonderful job with the creation of Israel. Even prior to the creation of Israel, they were able to set up what was called comisiones or comités por una Palestina hebrea, Hebrew Palestine, it was called paradoxically at that time, Hebrew Palestine, all over with a great success. And of course, at that time, the multilateral vote of the Latin Americans was 40% of the UN. And of course, it was very important to get the support of Latin Americans, the same way that the Palestinians now are searching the multilateral vote at the UN. At that time, Israel wanted to get a partition plan that will set up the idea of two states, and then eventually the acceptance to the UN in 1949. So the Latin American countries have been very supportive of Israel, I would say up till the 70s, very supportive. And in fact, there are so many stories that have been documented, and it has to do a lot to the Jews of Latin America that have been extremely active in this direction. We try to look into the push factors and the pull factors. When are the Jews running away, sort of, Latin America? When are the Jews inspired to come to Israel? And there are different periods. We do have another slide of this question of emigration to Israel. For many of the Jews who are here, you use the term Aliyah. Luciana can comment more on even a plan called Birthright, which brings young people to Israel every year by right to come to Israel. But the idea is that people should confront Israel and decide if they want to go and live there. And the term Aliyah, which means immigration, means to ascend, to go up to Israel. Whereas, the Israelis who leave Israel back to the diaspora are called Yordim, going down. And just to give you the sense that we are not talking about an isolated issue, at this time there are 5 times more Israeli Jews coming to the U.S. than U.S. Jews coming to Israel. So you can see the negative impact of emigration from Israel. So what we are talking about Latin America, the less attraction of Israel is not an isolated phenomenon. So because of time, I'm trying to move as fast as possible. let me talk quite a bit about Muslims in Latin America. I personally, being a Latin American, Israeli, U.S. citizen Jew, look how many identities. I was less familiar with the Arab side of the issue, but thanks to Janine that has been helping a lot. She's a Palestinian American and very much connected to Palestine. We have quite a lot of information now, and we are not done there yet because, in truth, there has been very little academic research about Arabs or Islam or Palestinians in Latin America. By me talking about three different identities with a stroke, you can realize that we are already facing some problem of identity, which is much simpler for the Jewish side when we talk about Jew and Israel. Israelita and Israeli. So close, right? So when you look at the figures, the gap between the minimalist figures and the maximalist figures is so high that we really cannot, and it's not our duty or our main purpose to establish the truth about the figures. It will be impossible. There are, Janine provided us with 28 footnotes about the figures. So we are talking about one demographer when it comes to the Jews. We are now talking about 28 different footnotes about the figures. They're all documented, the figures, but we don't have any sense of accuracy there. So we are talking about a spectrum. We say Janine is giving the minimalist and the maximalist. Sometimes the gap was so big that we really hesitated even to put it to the public display, but that's what you have. And that will, the next one will give you perhaps a more synthesized sense, which may be also relevant when we compare it with the U.S. We don't do the comparison with Jews in Latin America with the U.S. because most people are familiar with the statistics of Jews in the U.S. We're talking around 6 million, am I right? Jews in... yeah, so, in plus minus, right? But figures for Arabs in Latin America, they are in the U.S. are not clear either. And by the way, there is also a range there that Janice had a problem about, and then she will explain it to you why are the figures of the U.S. so accurate? You can see up to the single digit, and whereas where the figures of the Latin America are not. She has a prepared explanation for whoever wants to ask because it's really complex. Well, assuming that Muslims have solidarity with the Palestinians, which is a big question mark because there are all kinds of Muslims like Pakistanis or Indians that are so remote of the Middle East or the Arab Middle East. So you can see that the figures in Latin America here are more than between 1.5 to 2 million, which is so much larger than the Jews who are about 380,000. Then the Arabs, if you look at the figures, now we are hesitant. This is one of the figures that we're talking about 5 to 6 generations at least of descendants of the first Arab migrants to Latin America. Most of them are mixed marriages, most overwhelmingly. So you can multiply, for the first mixed marriage was half Arab, half non-Arab. The second one is a quarter. The third one is an eighth. If you consider Arab all the 5 generations, you get this number. But it will mean that centrality of the centrality of the Palestinian issue to the 5th generation will be like 1/16 or 1/32, whereas for Jewish families that are still Jews in the full sense, it's a main central focus. So we are giving this figure of 20 million that may be true, but as I say, we are not into a detective work to decide. But that's what has been a prevailing figure. And for Palestinians, which obviously this one is more relevant than the others, we are talking about Latin America to be a large reservoir of Palestinians. Perhaps the largest diaspora are in Latin America, let alone the neighboring countries to Israel-Palestine, where you have Palestinian refugees still in large numbers, some of them in refugee camps, And that's another issue we want to tackle, the difference between the right of return and things like that are coming up in a moment. So 600,000 that they are, we do have in the previous slide, the concentration, the same way that most Jews are concentrated in Argentina, most Palestinians are concentrated in Chile. There are between 200 to 350,000 Palestinians in Chile. And then there are two other large communities, because in Central America there are small countries, one in El Salvador, about 60,000, and the other one in Honduras, about 50,000. So this, by far, are like 80% of the Palestinians in Latin America, in these three countries. So now, the problem with the Palestinian identity, different from the Jewish identity and Israel, is that for a variety of reasons, you can probably get people giving you different answers. I mean, by the time that a Jew will say, you know, he's a Jew and he is related to Israel if he's Zionist, here we have so many alternative identities. Let me give you a breakdown. Firstly, the religious identity could be more important sometimes than the national identity. I mean, Christians, are much more united to the rest of Latin America than Muslims, obviously. And of course, there are more intermarried and so on. And whereas Jews are keeping their identity closer to Israel. Ethnic, the question of being Arab, these people who came to Latin America when there was no Palestine, not even an idea of Palestine, they came as Arabs. They were not identified themselves as Palestinians, which is a later development. The national identity comes later, as we see. Then people can say, you know, originally everybody was a Turco because they were coming from the Ottoman Empire. And then eventually, by the way, Jews as well, not only, they were all Turcos. Jews and then people spoke about Greater Syria, because especially the Christians in Lebanon, Israel, and Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, and Palestine, they had some sense of unity that was the Greater Syria. The Palestinian identity starts to emerge in the 1920s only. So people who came to Latin America before 1920s, they never thought themselves to be Palestinians. It may have evolved later on, but not by origin, and so on. The Zionists say next year in Jerusalem from time immemorial. Then there is a city identity, which I think is relevant also for the U.S. You have in the U.S. Palestinians organized according to city, which may have to do also with religion sometimes. You have, the Bethlehem Association, the Ramallah Association. And in Latin America, the city of origin, Bejala or Bethlehem, has a lot of sense of unity and sense of identity. And eventually, if you bring it down to the extended family level, which could be a tribe, if it's more a nomad kind of Bedouin type of origin, or if it's a Fallah, a peasant type of origin, it will be more a Hamula. These are extended families of thousands of people, and they are also very strongly related to identities. As we often say later on, in the remittances, you can see the difference between the national remittances given to the Jewish issues in Israel, national, to the family remittances that are given to Palestinians back in the land, and so on. And then, as a result of that, they have been more organized, the Palestinians, in social clubs, cultural clubs, sports clubs, rather than political clubs, whereas the Jewish community has been organized politically. I even say, according to political parties in Israel. Why should they be organized in Argentina according to the political parties in Israel? It's kind of an anachronism. By the way, it's, of course, changing that too. So we have also the history of the Palestinians in Latin America, and as you can see, it goes back to the Ottoman rule. The Jews were already even there from the Inquisition days, but we have some recollection of very, very early immigration in the early 19th century, and then through the Ottoman rule till the end. Now, it's only after the phase 3 that we really have to talk about a Palestinian identity flourishing in Latin America. Because before that, as you will see, even 48, took, in a way, the Palestinians who were living in Latin America unprepared to face the extraordinary drive of the Jews, the Zionists, for the creation of Israel. They did next to nothing. But that changed, that is changing more and more over time. I'd like to, in phase two, explain this issue of refugees, because the 1948 war in the Holy Land generated a large number of Palestinian refugees. About 3/4 of the Palestinians living in what is the state of Israel became refugees. It's a very large number for any nation, to 3/4. And the notion of the right to return, el-auda in Arabic, the right to return, has been the main motive. And in fact, some of the articles we read, when they talk about diaspora, they perhaps only talk about the refugees who are in the Arab countries, not even about Latin America. It's interesting, because that's like a number one priority, the return of those who are, especially those who are still living in very precarious conditions in refugee camps. But somehow the other Palestinians have been forgotten. I mean, because of the centrality of the right of return for the refugees who live in the Arab countries, in the neighboring countries. Different from the Jews, that the right of return or the law of return is connecting to Jews all over the world. As the Jews in Latin America, as I say, in large numbers, they benefited from the law of return and became automatic citizens of Israel after 6 months, which is, you know how difficult it is to become a U.S. citizen for a naturalized person here. 6 months you can vote in Israeli elections and so on. So we have this difference that the precarious situation of Palestinian refugees in the Arab countries is such a top priority that even in terms of generating support, it did not become a priority for the PLO, to put it this way, till very late. And obviously now we can see that happening with the UN and so on. We also do the functional relationship, as we did for the Jews. What is the political importance? What is the financial importance? The demographic? Very few Palestinians are coming back to Palestine, because the Israelis would not allow it, just to be very clear. But even before 1967, when many of the Palestinians in the West Bank were under Jordanian rule, they were not coming back. In the best case, they were building a second house for retirement, like a Florida type of situation for some of the Jews. I mean, yes, to have a second house, beautiful houses, in fact, in the West Bank were built for the day, and they have done well in Latin America, Arabs, so they could single. But the idea of returning from Latin America was not a priority for both sides. Let me move quickly now, because of time, into Islam in Latin America, because this is the issue that has been more in the news. And, after September the 11th, obviously, it connects to some concerns in this country. But we want to be very careful, and with the help of Janine and also Hanif, who has been more into the question of Iran, which is coming next, maybe we will try to be at this time very careful, because it seems like sensationalism is very much part of what we are seeing now. Although you can make a case that through radical Islam, we had seen effects from Argentina, Buenos Aires, with 2 bombs. Now to Mexico, the last couple of weeks, people are talking about a Mexican connection with the attempt to assassinate, an Iranian plot to try to assassinate the Saudi ambassador. So if you want to be an alarmist, you can say from Buenos Aires to the Mexican border with the U.S., the radical Islam is all over the place. We don't really, Hanif can say more, but we don't really think it's that dramatic. But there are beginnings there that need to be seen and considered. As I said, there's quite a large number of Muslims. We are not talking about the Muslims from the Caribbean, so I just want to clarify, because sometimes the figures include Pakistanis and Indians that in countries like Guyana or English-speaking Caribbean, they are Muslims. We are talking about Muslims that perhaps are converts, some blacks converted into Islam because they believe their origin, like Kia, was a Muslim, but also mostly Arabs. We're talking about Arabs. And interestingly, we are even talking about Arabs who, because of Dar el-Islam, that Islam is a religion of majority, when they came to Latin America, some Muslims, they became Christians. The president of Argentina, Menem, from Syrian origin, for instance, he became a Catholic. In fact, at that time, to be a president, you needed to be a Catholic, Apostolic, Roman, otherwise by the Constitution. Now that changed for the better. Anybody can be a president. But when he was, perhaps with ambitions of being president, he was, his parents actually, when he was young, converted into Catholicism. Now we have a trend, like in El Salvador, 9,000 Arabs Palestinians are becoming Muslim, and there are 2 mosques now, because they want to go back to the roots. And the roots were Muslim, and they became Christian when they came to El Salvador. So Islam is growing, and also you can see that the Saudi Arabia is doing some proselytism there, building some mosques, nothing of extraordinary dimension, but it's happening. And even Iran, when it comes to Venezuela, they built a mosque in Caracas, and obviously the Venezuela connection with Iran, as you will see, is very, very strong. Now, the question of connections of Al-Qaeda with Iran and Hezbollah, there are lots of different versions, and we don't want to go, surely now with no time into it. We'll try to do our best to clarify what we understand to be the true picture. But again, that's not the main thing. We are trying to understand how does it reflect on the Arab-Jewish issue. That's what we want to reflect. But as I say, that there is a warring presence. There are cities like an area called the Triple Frontera between Paraguay, Brazil, and Argentina, where there's a large number of Muslims there connected from, maybe Hezbollah, maybe Hamas, maybe Al-Qaeda, and it's a very gray area about whether they're doing other illegal transactions and not only weapons or the threats of terrorism and so on. We are going to skip something that we think is very important for our research because of time is of essence. I keep looking at the watch, and as you remember from the Matrix, all what's happening among Arabs and Jews in the diaspora has to do with the input from Israel and the PLO and the Arab countries, because the arrows are both ways. If Israel would not be pushing for Jews to be more connected to the Holy Land, there will be less connection. And if PLO will not be pushing, there will be less connection. So we need to look into what is Israel doing with the Jewish community in Latin America, what are the Arab countries doing, and eventually we're now talking about Iran too, because as you will see, Iran has a growing role in this context as well. So we're trying to see if there is any periodization that could be relevant to change of Israeli policy, or in this case, Palestinian policy in Latin America. And eventually, by the time, let me only go to the bottom end, which is after 1988, it looks like no longer we are talking about the zero-sum competition between Israel and Palestine. We are all talking about the two-state solution. These are good news. We can come to an agreement theoretically because both sides agree to a two-state solution. But what happens with the Palestinian identity is that there are different ways to look into to be a patriotic Palestinian in Latin America. Now look at I'm talking about Aaron. I don't see Aaron Miller, but we spoke about it previously. He wrote a piece for Foreign Policy saying that there are 5 Palestinian identities now. So you can imagine a Palestinian diaspora with this concern. I want to be a good Palestinian, and then am I supporting the PLO? Am I supporting the Palestinian Authority, which is ruling in the West Bank? Or if I'm a Muslim, am I supporting Hamas? Maybe, because, they are ruling in Gaza. Now, Palestinians from East Jerusalem, they have a better, they are discriminated. I have been living in Jerusalem most of my life. They are discriminated, but they are better off than the Palestinians living in the West Bank or Gaza. So there is some connection. Shall I help my brothers there or the others because they are better off? Let alone about the Israeli Palestinians. The Israeli Palestinians are full citizens of Israel. They have lots of legitimate grievances. But, by all means, if you look at the GNP per capita or any other thing, this is another type of connection, that if you are connected to a village in Israel, I have a colleague here, a dear colleague, who is connected to a village in Israel, an Arab colleague. I mean, who are you going to help? I mean, you have your own constituency there and so on. And finally, the refugees in the Arab countries, they also they need help. I mean, so charity to whom? I mean, you have a dilemma, whereas in Israel, it's still a unified government. You can argue whether you like it or not, but there is one elected government that represents everybody. I can also say that there are different milestones for Israel. The one thing I want to comment is this conflict has been escalating, and eventually, hopefully, you will read the monograph because it is important. When Israel was in danger, there was more support of Jews in Latin America than when the existence of Israel is less in danger. The existence of Israel was mostly in danger in 67 and 73, the Yom Kippur War. And it has gone up to, if you want, 1975, when Zionism was condemned as racism. The worst thing in the world is Zionism. But then, no longer Israel's existence was threatened. We have what we call asymmetric wars. We have wars against civilians. They are not popular wars because many of the victims are civilians on both sides. So it's no longer the Israel David fighting a Goliath, but perhaps it's the Palestinian David fighting an Israeli superpower of the military. This makes it more difficult for the Jews to connect because, as you can see, Jews would like to live in harmony with the host country and the home country, and the same with the Palestinians. If the local government in Latin America and Israel will be on the same page, the Jews will be very happy. Same for the Palestinians. If they could get a triangle where they would be part of a happy triangle, everybody is friendly with everybody, obviously. And we are saying, to make this triangle happen, maybe the Arab and the Jewish community will have to do some work. And that's what we're trying to say. You have to do some work for your own self-interest, of course, for the benefit of peace in Israel and peace in Palestine, but also for your own self-interest. So I'm skipping the Israeli policy in Latin America, the Arab policy in Latin America, and I want to go into Iran because I know that there is an interest nowadays on Iran. But it's not that they are more important than the Israeli policy on the Arab policy. Please do not misunderstand. It has to do with Cindy pressing for time. And I know you're going to leave at a certain moment, and that's what we are. Now, Iran may have a variety of interests in Latin America, and we are not going to spend any time judging the overall picture. We're going to mention these interests, as you can see, economic, anti-U.S. rhetoric in the backyard, and maybe even some nuclear development issues with a question mark. All that Hanif can help us more if you need to. But on the narrowing focus on Israel-Palestine, what is Iran doing in Latin America in relation to Israel-Palestine, which is what we only care? We would say it would be wrong to assume that the current wave of most Latin American countries establishing relations with the state of Palestine, recognizing, I don't think it has to do with Iran. We don't think so. We think it has to do with the initiative of the Latin Americans from Costa Rica, with Ascos Arias in 2008, big change for Costa Rica, to Mercosur, that has been playing interesting good news, bad news for Israel, getting them to be part of Mercosur, and immediately the four countries recognizing Palestine, the state of Palestine. So we don't think that Iran has been powerful enough to push Latin America to recognize. Latin America is doing it out of their own self-interest, to put it this way. But on the other hand, I think that Iran has been instrumental in encouraging to cut relations with Israel. So because you see, the country like Uruguay, for instance, who has wonderful relations with Israel, historically, we owe so much to Uruguay from day one. They also have good relations with Palestine now, and they don't see that it should affect negatively the relations with Israel. I was there, as I said, recently, and I could see the wonderful relationship they have with both. However, Iran is pushing a little bit farther, cut relations with Israel, and they were able to, these three governments that are mentioned here, they have their own agenda too, but surely, Chavez has as a protagonist, he wants to be all over the place. He wants to be a world leader, and it's popular to cut relations with Israel when it comes to the third world and so on. So but definitely Ahmadinejad had to do with it. And the same with Bolivia that he visited, the same with Nicaragua. So I think that without giving the credit to Iran to be the one who got Latin America connected to Palestine, you can say the opposite. He's pushing for cutting relations with Israel. And exporting violence, I think in the case of Argentina, it is definitely something that can be said. I mean, there's been an investigation, believe it or not, from 92 till now that has not finished. I've been to the office facing the presidential palace, the Casa Rosada, one full floor with investigators about what happened in the case of the blowing up of the Israeli embassy, 29 people killed, and the blowing up of the Jewish community, about, I can't remember, 80 people killed, 85 people killed. And the prosecutor, Mr. Nisman, has been working, and we don't have yet the full picture, except that we know that Iran has been connected officially by declaring some people persona non grata. We do know that one of the head of the security at the embassy who ran away was directly connected to some of the details, especially the second one has to do with the Jewish community, which is so interesting. The first one maybe was more allegedly connected to the Hezbollah as an agent of Iran, if you wish, the blowing up of the Israeli embassy. But the second one, which has to do with the local Jews, was more connected to Iran directly. You know, it's telling you something about the Ahmadinejad in particular. So there's a lot to say there. And the Mexico connection, I mean, Univision knows better. I think that yesterday they had a piece. I don't have a chance to watch it, so you can tell us what's the latest about the Mexico connection with Saudi. The Holocaust denial, which is some of the Iranian, trademark lately since Ahmadinejad, has been also used in Latin America, even in a country like Uruguay. Recently, the Iranian ambassador in Uruguay, from all places, had the courage to speak about denying the Holocaust, which got an extraordinary reaction in Uruguay against that, I mean, from all the sectors. And Ahmadinejad's use of the word Zionist as a cover for anti-Semitism is something that is so much resented in Latin America, especially Jewish communities still with a strong connection to Israel. But as I say, you may see that to be part of a message to oppressed nations. He's trying to put it, I mean, Ahmadinejad in a kind of disconnecting with the U.S., who is Israel is after all the tool of imperialism and so on. But the important thing to mention is that Fidel Castro condemned the Iranian government statements on the Holocaust, and it's a beautiful interview in the Atlantic magazine of Goldstein. We do have the full text, we'll reproduce, and he's going very deep in the question of saying the Jews have been those who suffer most through history. How could he dare, Ahmadinejad? So it's very interesting. The last thing, we talk about Argentina, paradoxically with the Jewish foreign minister, formerly U.S. ambassador to Washington, Hector Timerman, formerly my student in Israel when he took exile with his father for a few years, has been somehow flirting with Iran. You can see the increase in trade from 30 million to 1.2 billion, so national interest is part of it. But the question of how to deal with the diplomatic impasse, it's not being resolved, but it's in the middle of a kind of a hate, maybe now love relationship, which, is problematic. Okay, now, obviously the last thing that we skip now is we have to look into political change in Latin America. The question is, democratic countries, are they better for the Jews? Are they better for the Palestinians? Are they better for both? What was easier for both sides of the equation? We want to talk a little bit about that let me come to the end, because I think I'm finishing my time. And the end has a couple of slides. As I said, one thing that we are mostly interested is to try to understand comparatively the difference between Arabs and Jews towards Palestine and Israel. So we have the ones that fit in one page. Luciana was unable to put 3 or 4 more that we kept aside because they don't fit in one page for the slide. You can see the difference between the two communities, so the two diasporas. The Jews obviously are an old and established. Palestinian, in this case, we always have a problem to call it Arab, Palestinian, Muslim, but we sort of target on Palestinian. But it's a new identity. Palestinian identity is a new identity, and it is relational to Israel. It's very much relational to Israel. The loyalty of the Israeli organized community is to the incumbent government. Problem with the Palestinians, as we mentioned a moment ago, they have multiple loyalties to represent, and that makes a conflict within the community. Whom are you supporting? I would say the organized Jewish community supports the government in power in Israel, no matter who. Could be more left, could be more right. Although I'm a bit worried that by generating automatic support, the Israeli government generated some kind of a robot or a golem, I would say, a monster even, that can be some more extreme according to the prophecy that diasporas are more extreme and so on. But in general, in Latin America, I would say they support, as we say, el gobierno de turno, the government that is in power in Israel. Interesting on the financial contribution, you can see the Jewish contribution has been to the state of Israel, just buying bonds of the state of Israel, or to enterprises that are national enterprises like the Jewish National Fund. I remember from my bar mitzvah, instead of getting nice presents, I got a lot of trees that were planted by the Jewish National Fund in Israel. I mean, I couldn't find them actually. I was looking for them, but the entire woods were planted on my name. And well, that's lots of trees in Israel thanks to the Jewish National Fund. It was very desertic, but that was a very good example of donations. Not family, but just to a national cause. And of course, some sort of private, local institutions like universities. Every university has an association of friends. The Red Cross, what we call Magen David, has an association of friends. You name it. So there is a lot of collective remittances, if you want. Whereas in the Palestinian side, it's still mostly family remittances. Or, local. For instance, if you are an alumni of Bethlehem University, you will give money to Bethlehem University, but really small amounts. And, I've been there so many times in Bethlehem University. There are some buildings that carry 1 or 2 names of sort of major donors. But you go to Hebrew University, not only the buildings have the names of the donors, but the rooms have the names of the donors. My office has the name. Only the toilets have no name of donors. And I mean, Casa Mexico, Casa Argentina, Casa, you name it, all over the place. So, there's a big difference there. The centrality of the homeland, as I said, Israelita. We have another reference to the Israeli, the Israeli embassy to be perceived to be the center of the Jewish community very often. I mean, normally Israeli consuls are supposed to deal with the Jewish community worldwide. So I was reminded of the perception of a kind of an empire, like a Roman empire with consuls, and the consul is in touch with the local. So this idea of the centrality of Israel has to do also with the centrality of the embassy of Israel in the respective countries, let alone the issue of security. I just want to be honest, especially now that there are problems of security, as you can see in Latin America. The security of any synagogue is guaranteed by local Jews that have been trained by Israel. I mean, the Israeli embassy has, it's no secret, maybe it's half a secret. There is a name for that, and there is probably somebody from the Mossad who specializes in providing training to the local people, the local Jews, to provide security to the synagogues and so on. So definitely the connection of centrality of Israel is very, very strong. And but decreasing. I was saying we are now into diasporism more than Zionism, and I think that's an alert for Israel if they care. Maybe they don't care anymore because the the Jewish potential of Aliyah, of immigration, has been more or less exhausted. 95% of the Jews now live in democratic countries, so you cannot expect the idea of having Israel as a refuge, which is such an important area, to be irrelevant. They don't need a refuge, to put it this way. They perceive it this way. So, but it's decreasing. And I think that, if we would have more time, there is such a important element then to be dealt with by Israel. By the way, just to give you one example, Israel closed 2 embassies in spite of the small Jewish community begging them not to close, one in Bolivia, one in Paraguay. I was present in Paraguay when it happened, begging, and in fact the Jewish community willing to put money for all the local expenses. And yet Israel decided to close it down and to open new consulates in the US. Obviously, Israel is putting all the eggs in one basket now. They are giving up on multilateralism at the UN. They don't expect any vote to carry for Israel. They all expect the US veto to be, and then if you have, I think Israel has 9 or 10 consulates in the US, perhaps, I don't know whether Mexico has more, many more, but I would say second to Mexico, more than Canada and more than Salvador will be Israel. 52 Mexican consulates. And who is second after Mexico? Will it be Israel, would you say? Who? Well, I mean, I think we have 10 or 11 now. So it's a large number, and the price is closing down embassies. Even there were others in the list. Eventually, there was too much pressure of the local Jewish community like Panama to close it down. So we have this situation. So centrality decreasing. For Palestinian Arabs, the Palestinian issue has not been central. I mean, we have to say 90% of them are Christians. And, there are only 2% Christians left in the Palestinian territory. So Christianity, I mean, rather than to say we should not leave the Holy Land without Christians, which will be one way of being like Zionists, the affective relationship to Palestine is diminishing because there are only 2% of Christians left in Palestine. 2%, very little. So, and yet there is an increasing acceptance of the Palestinian issue, which is not surprising, especially for young people from the left. Janina has mentioned the General Union of Palestinian Students that have diaspora chapters very strong in Chile, for instance, General Union of Palestinian Students, because the left is, same way that in 48 the cause of the left was Israel, now the cause of the left is Palestine. And of course, if you are young and a student in Chile, that is all revolting now. If you are Palestinian, you're definitely going to be, this kind of. So we have this unifying effect, yes. I mean, the Ashkenazi-Sephardi divide that was in Latin America strong is no longer strong. I mean, there is a melting pot like in Israel. And it's interesting that, it has to do with the way you pray. You pray with a Hebrew accent. I mean, the Sephardic, many things. Israel has been a melting pot, yes, and that helped the diaspora to be a melting pot. Whereas when it comes to the unifying effect of Christians and Muslims in the Palestinian community, there is not a strong Muslim-Christian unifying effect. So you can see, okay, well, I don't think I can go through all that without exceeding my time, but as we are promoting maybe for you to keep in touch and to eventually see that hopefully the monograph that will be accepted for publication by the Wilson Center, because there's a lot more to say. Finally, the one thing I think is very important for our research is what we want to see, what can be done. I go back to the first image of diasporas being part of the problem or the solution. Or to put it in other ways, are Arabs and Jews in Latin America importing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to Latin America, or could Arab and Jews export to Israel-Palestine the very good tradition of coexistence, that has been around and still is quite okay between Arabs and Jews in Latin America. Basically, I don't have it here, but the Arabs and Jews who came from the Ottoman Empire were like brothers at the beginning. They were also sharing the same institutions, the same banks, the same neighborhoods, the same business. In fact, there was the first Asociaciones Sirio-Libanesas, including Jews in the board of the Asociaciones Sirio-Libanesas. So clearly that was, so there is a good background, and even now, institutionally, they are confronted now. They are confronted. They are like importing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Interfaith was a little bit better, but even interfaith after the two last wars, Lebanon and Gaza, has been somehow disconnected. But when it comes to personal relations, there are good personal relations, except when there is a time of violent conflict. They don't talk about the conflict. I mean, you can talk about business, you can talk about family, but on a personal relationship, an Arab and a Jew, normally they avoid talking about Gaza and so on, which is a shame. So what we think is there must be ways to remember the period of coexistence and to try to go back to the land in missions. I mean, in Brazil, we have an experience called Caravana Paulista. Cannot go into that they even thought about bringing Pelé, because soccer is so important for Israelis and Palestinians. And in fact, there are some good deeds done by the Peres Center for Peace with mixed soccer, Jewish, Palestinian teams. So why not to get Pelé to bless it and there are all kinds of ideas. And some ideas are what we would say interfaith. Other ideas are what we call Cousins Club, Club de Primos. I've been around the countries mentioned here, I mean all these countries lately, and I've been testing the waters, whether is it possible to see that happening, or if it's happened. Very little things are happening, next to nothing. But I can see the potential if, when we come to policy relevance, even the governments will encourage, the governments of Latin America should encourage Arabs and Jews to work together. I, for instance, spoke with the Foreign Minister of Uruguay, Almagro. We spoke with the Deputy Foreign Minister, Conte, when Marisa was present. We told them, look, every time a high dignitary comes to Israel and Palestine, when he goes back or before he leaves, is to get the Arab and the Jewish community together, to get some views and also to debrief them and brief them and to encourage the idea that they can do things together and incorporate them. They like the idea. So it may be a day where we'll have the triangle, as I said, of diaspora, local government, and the moderates, I would say at least, of Israel and Palestine. I don't foresee that settlers and Hamas could be part of the deal, but others could, and that will be the day. And I think my time has, I'm exceeding my time, am I right, by far? So the preliminary conclusions, I leave it on the screen, and perhaps we should leave some room for questions, because it's a very long story.
Right.
Thank you very much.
Eddie, thank you. Thank you for this splendid overview, and I think it's a hallmark not only of your teaching style, but also your research style, that your three assistants include a Jewish American, Iranian American, and Palestinian American. I think it's a model of how to create collaboration in the very thought process. I'd like to invite questions and comments. I'm sure there are many. Please identify yourselves and wait for the microphone. We have two microphones on either side. We'll take a couple of questions together, go back to Eddie, and then turn back for another round. Sure, right here.
Thank you very much, and congratulations, Professor Kaufman, as usual, very entertaining and illustrating. One point that you did not cover, and I wonder why was it, or where it's not relevant.
Excuse me, if you could introduce yourself.
Oh, I'm sorry, Hernan Rosenberg. I'm an independent consultant in Washington. What about the revival of Jewish religiousness in Latin America, which I think is something that has a major impact in all this business? The generations of the 60s and 70s were pretty much like secular and probably united more by Zionism than anything else. Mm. And right now we're seeing the opposite. So you see anything about that? Thank you.
Shall I answer one?
Well, let's take a couple of questions. Sure, Diana.
Dina Siegel, I'm the director of the Latino and Latin American Institute of the American Jewish Committee. First of all, I would like to congratulate you, Eddie, and also the Wilson Center for undertaking this research. I think it was past due. This is something that, of course, we follow very closely. This is what we do on the advocacy part, although we also are involved in policy issues regarding relations between Israel, the United States, Latin America, and diasporas. I mean, we try to cover all the intersections and their complexity. We have been following in the last year, particularly a turning point that you kind of spoke about, but I think is very important because I do think that it signals a change really in what has been going on since today. And it's this whole issue of the unilateral declaration of a Palestinian state. For the first time, I think we saw that the Middle East conflict was part of domestic agendas, of regional agendas, and of hemispheric agendas. And this, I think, signals very much a change. We saw it, for example, in the meeting of SICA, of the Central American Security Initiative, where they were discussing organized crime in the region, but they invited also, as the issue was being discussed all over the hemisphere, they invited a Palestinian and an Israeli envoys to talk about, not their perspective on crime, but about, the whole issue of the Declaration of Independence. So that was really, really, I think, meaningful in terms of what we're going to be seeing and the challenges we're going to be seeing ahead in the years to come. And just one more thing about working together. I think that in Chile we saw something very interesting. For the first time, we saw President Piñera, in the midst of this debate, the first Chilean president in office that went to Israel and to Palestine, took a delegation of Chilean Palestinians and Chilean Jews to Israel, and that was a very interesting, let's say, initiative to bring both communities together and to find common solutions.
Let's take this question back here, and then we'll come back to Eddie.
Thank you. I'm Leon Weintraub, University of Wisconsin, Washington Semester in International Affairs. I'd just like to know, sir, if during your research you found anything that might explain why over the years most of the countries in Latin America have had very positive bilateral relations with Israel, but very often they're frequently part of the anti-Israel majority at the United Nations. Seems to be a split personality there. Wonder if you found anything that might explain that.
Okay.
I'd like to perhaps end this round by asking one other question, which is that the presence of Iran and Hezbollah gets a lot of play in Washington and to a lesser extent in the United States. Other than Argentina, do you get a sense, and outside of Venezuela where the presence is very large and to a lesser extent the other ALBA countries, do you get a sense that a growing terrorist presence or the potential for that is of concern to governments in the region?
Okay, well, I may delegate one question. I would very much like my colleagues, I consider them to be my partners. So maybe one of the questions I will delegate it because, Hanif, if you are alert, the last one may be for you. We are a team. We are really a team, and I'm very proud of it. Okay, for Hernan Rosenberg, it's a very important issue that relates to what I say diasporization. Because there is this question whether the more Orthodox, the more pro-settler, one would assume. But it's not the case in Latin America. If you take the case of Chabad, which has done a lot of inroads, especially with young people. Chabad is, I don't know if people are familiar in the U.S., is like I don't want to define it. I have a rabbi here who can define it, but they have a sense of mission, and they may be satisfied with just very little, but they would like people to feel more according to the Jewish tradition. They are very active in Latin America, but they are not active for Israel. I'm surprised because Chabad in Israel became very much connected to the settlers in Israel proper, but not in Latin America. So what we see, as I see it, is instead of being organized in the Latin American diaspora according to political parties, as the first generation, as I say, one brother went to Israel, one brother went to Latin America, now they are organized according to congregations, like in this country. And it goes from Reform to conservative to Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox. And that's exactly what's happening in Latin America as I see it. And the question of being more religious, whereas in Israel you could correlate, unfortunately, to be more intransigent when it comes to the issue of Israeli-Arab peace, Israeli-Palestinian peace, I don't see that to be so relevant in Latin America. I've seen, some secular leaders in Uruguay in the Jewish community that are very strongly pro-Israel government, right or wrong. And I met people that are more Chabad, that they don't have a strong feeling about Israel. In fact, their function is to stay in the diaspora, if I may say, not Zionist. That's my take. But there is definitely a replacement of Israel as central in the Jewish identity by congregation or religion, if you want to put it this way. By the way, because it's now more religious, a large part of the secular are assimilating into the general society, and they don't feel the attraction to religion, which is something that we have to realize. Zionism provided a secular religion, to put it this way, for the seculars, and it's less attractive. When it comes to the unilateral declaration, Dina, she's absolutely right. The Palestinian and the Israelis have been protagonistic there forever, including in the OAS as observers and so on. The new actor is the Palestinians. And now it's very nice and interesting that they're invited both together. And when we're talking about inviting the Palestinians, we're talking about inviting the Palestinian Authority, the PLO that has gone through a lot of transformation. Just to give you an example, former ambassadors in Latin America were appointed by a guy called Farouk Kaddoumi, who used to be, or still is, mostly in Tunis. He was opposed to the Oslo Agreement, and he has his cronies and so on. No longer that. Now the newer ones are appointed by Riyad Malki, who is a foreign minister who was educated in Colombia, by the way, and who is a moderate. I have the privilege to have been writing with him in books and so on. He used to be an NGO person before, so, we are very good colleagues. So the Palestinians that are coming, and I've been to several conferences with Riyad Malki organized by the UN, including in Chile and including in Venezuela and in Uruguay, I can tell you that they are not an extreme Palestinian voice. And I think that they are exactly doing what Israel did in 1940, the Jewish community, to try to get votes, which would bring me immediately. So I personally, I wanted to say, in this research, we are not neutral. And it will be a mistake for people who doesn't know us to believe that we are neutral observers. We have strong feelings, most of us at least. But we try to be impartial. That's the best we can do. But we have feelings. And I can say, speaking a little bit about feelings, I don't see a zero-sum issue if there will be a presence of Palestinians together with Israelis in regional fora in Latin America. In fact, when I was in Uruguay, I've been 3 times in Uruguay. I was so fortunate this year. And I told people that, if Oslo could play a role, and there are no national interest in Israel-Palestine at that time. They played a very positive role. The fact that it didn't work, you can blame the Israelis and the Palestinians, but not the Norwegians. They did their best. I say Uruguay has the same population as Norway, and it's far, but Norway is also far. And I don't see why Uruguay, that has played a very good role with Israel at the beginning, and now with the Palestinians, and based on their own understanding of the Montevideo Declaration of Recognition of States. It's not that they are doing something that is not their own traditional legal culture. I say bring more Arabs, more Jews. Exactly what Piñera did. When you go next time, Mr. Almagro, take Jews and take Arabs, because you can play a constructive role as Norway. So I think that it could be a blessing, but it's a challenge. You don't know who is going to carry the day, where there are people with narrow national interests, and obviously national interest is not to be a host or to be to provide hospitality to 2 sides. National interest may be now more pro-Palestinian, and maybe in the case of Venezuela, even pro-Hamas, and so on. But I agree with Ina, this is a very wonderful opportunity, a challenge. And finally, this idea, this contradiction between the very good bilateral relations with Latin Americans, with Israel, and very difficult multilateral relations, I mean, the voting at the UN. At the beginning, it went together. It just started to change, as I said, in the 70s. And let me explain. At the beginning, the first two votes that were crucial for Israel were the partition vote, 1947, November, that would recognize a Jewish state and a Palestinian state. There's a lot of things to reflect on that. Now we're also talking about the two-state solution, different borders. We should be happy, I think, both sides, but sometimes we talk about borders more about sharing. But in any case, Latin America was very supportive and provided the two-thirds necessary votes that were required. Latin America was 40% of the voting power of the UN. So the Israeli effort and the Jewish local effort was to secure the multilateral support. Bilateral, there was nothing. There was not even a state at that time. And they relied on the honorary consuls that were Jews, by the way, not necessarily affluent, but dedicated Jews, Zionist Jews, that were very good in lobbying. Let me give you an example about Chile, since we spoke about Piñera. The Comité Pro Palestina Hebrea in Chile included in the board, without they knowing, 4 future presidents of Chile, from Allende at the left, Frey Christian Democrat, González Videla Radical, and Alessandri Conservative. Look what a bingo for a lobbying of a local Jewish community. Perhaps an emissary from Israel, from Palestine came once or twice to encourage the local Jews to do that. But that was the work of the Jewish community. There's no question about it. And without knowing 4 future presidents, that's why you can see that even Piñera has this sense that it can do some good. Chile has been, Chile had the embassy in Jerusalem. Only the more national interests, large countries, Mexico, and Argentina and Brazil had the embassy in Tel Aviv and Cuba eventually, and Peru for a while. But the rest, all of the embassies in Jerusalem, the bilateral relations were excellent. But that started to change in the mid-70s. Even 67, the resolution, the 242 resolution that calls for Israel withdrawal of territories in Spanish or their territories in English or in French, the wording and everything else is what Israel wanted. It was actually called the Latin American resolution because it was backed by Latin America, whereas the other one, which was the Yugoslavian resolution backed by the Soviet Union, called for immediate withdrawal of Israel from all the territories without any conditions. So the Latin Americans were crucial, even in 1967, to provide what was the best option of the two for Israel. But in 75, it started to change. When I look into change, I say, why did it change? I say, everything changed. Israel changed. The Palestinians started to change. The world changed. The Latin American changed. And now I'm saying the diasporas are changing. So what I'm saying is, in 75, it was terrible for Israel because this resolution of Zionism, racism, was supported by Mexico and Brazil. Am I right? Yes. The two largest countries supported, and there were many that abstained. Only the small countries of Latin America were opposed to that. The beauty is that this resolution was rescinded by the UN more than, 20 years later? Yeah, in the early 90s, which I don't know if there was any other UN resolution that was rescinded in the history of the UN. Probably the only one that they passed a resolution and they rescinded the resolution. And the Latin Americans were okay on the rescinding, at least. But the more globalization, the more Latin America became interested in the Middle East. Obviously, look at the billions of dollars of trade of Argentina.
Is this on? Yeah. Okay. In respect to your question, basically, from what I've been researching and looking at, there's been much attention on obviously Argentina and Venezuela, But in respect to the smaller countries, it seems that although they've had relationships, their diplomatic relationship with Iran is getting a lot of attention due to, I think, strategic long-term calculations. They can't really afford to let Iran, I guess, run amok, if you want to say that, in their countries. I feel like they publicly they try to show that that we have good relations with Iran, but I feel like they maybe not want to get embarrassed by if something were to happen, if something is found out, that they're allowing maybe their proxy Hezbollah or agents of Hezbollah establish a foundation there. But that being said, there's been much. I was recently at an AEI panel a few weeks ago about trouble in America's backyard, and much of this focus has been on Venezuela, obviously being the headquarters of the expansion into Latin America. And basically, without Venezuela, they can't. Iran cannot spread into these other Latin American countries. It's kind of almost with Chavez's permission. And also, when I was at this panel, I was amazed to see the former Deputy Secretary of State of the Western Hemisphere, Ambassador Noriega, was presenting photos and all of this intelligence, that photos of such as Hezbollah officials meeting with Venezuelan officials, and all this tangible evidence of their connections, and that has yet to be found with some of the other countries. But and I would imagine if that connection was there people would be presenting it. But AEI is definitely leading the forefront in this, and I would imagine if some of those other countries were to have these relations, or were allowing Hezbollah and its network to establish relations there, I would imagine it should be presented at some point. And like,
how many more embassies did Iran open since Ahmadinejad in Latin America?
I believe 6, if I can remember correctly. So since Ahmadinejad's first term, he has taken the big step of establishing these relations. But and so basically, Iran's what they're basically doing in these other smaller countries is establishing cultural centers. Now, these cultural centers, they have Iranian literature, many things regarding to Iranian culture to kind of present it to these nations and people that aren't used to it. And so at some point, these cultural centers, from what I've been reading, have been used to recruit people of either they could be Latin American Muslims, or they could be Latin American citizens that are sympathetic to Iran, or maybe the Palestinian issue, the Israeli-Palestinian issue as well.
Let me add 2 things. There is no significant number of Iranians in Latin America, from all we know. And if there will be some, they'll probably be opposed to the regime, as in this country. So there is no question of a diaspora activity in favor of Iran. And the other thing is, through the help of Hale, and he reading Farsi, what Ahmadinejad is doing is like a one-man show, and not necessarily supported by the entire regime. In fact, he has been criticized in parliament by making promises of investing money in Latin America in like a bike factory and things and so on, when the situation in Iran, the economic situation, is not good, and or maybe because of political reasons, anything that some hardliners can criticize a hardliner like Ahmadinejad is worth doing it. So Latin America has been part of this criticism in Farsi that we found.
If I just add one more thing, also after the 2009 elections in Iran, President Ahmadinejad has received much criticism within his own government. So he kind of had a blank diplomatic check during his first term, and now during his second term, he really doesn't have that. That check has been kind of cashed in. His political rivals within Iran are making it really hard for him to implement. Not only the projects have been implemented, but basically come through with these projects have been very difficult for him because his rivals want to see him not succeed. So his foreign policy in Latin America, as a result, has somewhat been affected by the 2009 elections.
We have time for some more questions. All the way in the back.
Thank you. Brenda Seaver, U.S. Department of State. My question centers on Argentine-Iran relations that you referred to briefly, and what we appear to be seeing as some kind of shift in that relationship. You commented that Hector Timmerman is a former student of yours. So I'd really like to hear more about what you think is going on in what might be overstated as a warming of relations between Argentina and Iran. What you think the source of the changing relationship is. Is it purely economic? You made reference to the uptick in the trade relationship. And how far you think Buenos Aires can go with that relationship, given the influential Jewish constituencies there and the legacy of the Israeli embassy and AMIA bombings. But we've definitely seen a change in rhetoric, a change in behavior towards Tehran. But there are a lot of constraints that would prevent Buenos Aires from being able to go too far with that, I would think. But anything you can add on that, and on Timmerman's background and how that might bear on his role in, being a focal point in this relationship.
But if I could just add to that, there were actually press reports in Argentina that Timmerman had sort of offered to the Iranian authorities to drop charges as part of this warming, and I'm wondering, what you sense to be the situation, in Argentina, in addition to the questions laid out.
It's such a current event that we don't have any, as academics, we don't have enough of documentation to be able to establish the truth. So I'm rather hesitant to make some final judgment about the amount of change, given, as you mentioned, the constraints on possible changes towards Iran. I'll say the following. It's not only Timmerman, although he may have a lot to do with it, but also Christina Kirchner. She mentioned, at the UN in her speech, the importance of establishing constructive relations with Iran. I mean, that was more than a signal because, why should she mention in the limited time that she has in New York at the General Assembly to talk about that? So there was definitely a message there. Now, I think that my interpretation, but it's based on just mostly speculation, I don't have, is that, yes, trade, 1.2 billion is extremely important for Argentina as compared with 30 million a couple of years ago, 2008, if I'm not mistaken. So Argentina is into, they would also like to be an emerging, like Peru and Brazil. And they're definitely doing well because of commodities and so on. So I can see that to be a main reason to open a new page. But they are looking for a way to do that without being a sellout, as you were indicating, Cindy, on a horrible thing that occurred in Argentina with the complicity of Iran. And this is something that is not only because they are still asking for the extradition. Even Ahmadinejad said that he will kind of respond to concerns of Argentina in the investigation. He did say that, sort of to lower the threshold on the Iranian side. He did also kind of went down a little bit on the previous attitude of the Iranian government. I mean, it's a long way to go. This guy, Nisman, is still all over the place going around. And I think that the Jewish community, they did not forget. They may not be so Zionistic, but when it comes to this issue, there is something called Memoria Activa. Every Monday I've been there. I even spoke a couple of times when I'm in Argentina. I like to go there every Monday, if I'm not mistaken, in front of the Supreme Court of Justice. There is a gathering of relatives of those people who were killed in the two bomb attempts. So I don't know that it will be so easy. When it comes to Timmerman himself, in many ways he's a maverick on so many other things too. He wants to be proactive, I would say, in foreign policy in general. And he's proactive, yes, and sometimes he's very criticized for different things he says at different times. I don't know when it has to do with the Israeli-Palestinian problem in particular. I can tell you when he was young, as I say, when he was my student, and when he was with his father, Jacobo Timmerman, in exile in Jerusalem, where I was a professor at Hebrew University, they had plenty of time because, you know, so we talk a lot. And when I was once for dinner at the Argentine embassy in Washington, he mentioned that, you know, he was glad I was there because I was his professor, who took him once to a demonstration of Peace Now that we'll never forget. So if one can judge from a public statement over dinner, there were many people were over the dinner, saying that Peace Now is his own reflection on a solution, you could say that if he is a maverick and he has a personal preference, he will not be for Netanyahu, to put it this way. It will not be for Netanyahu. That is, you know, these are facts. I mean, the fact that he say that. But what is leading him now is that something like zero. I think he was quite instrumental in Mercosur in this issue of recognizing simultaneously. Paraguay took a little bit longer, but they agreed together to recognize the Palestinian state. And I think he was part of it. He was part of it. So I think he has a role to play, and I think that he is also economic interest.
Okay. We have time for maybe one or two more questions, if there are any. Sure, back here.
Thank you. Thank you. Carola Weil from the University of Southern California, Annenberg School. I'm interested in another dimension to this diaspora question, which is Europe. Because if you look at the relationship of Israel to Europe, where it has affiliate status with the EU and with many of the research organizations, as well as the very strong, or used to be stronger, relationship between South America in particular, and the Southern Cone, and Europe, where do you see this multilateral evolution going? Is it completely dead? Is there some, because you know Europe has become much more vocal and proactive also, particularly if you look at Germany or France in how it is interacting with Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian issue. What happens to the Latin population, Latin American population in Europe that might also be involved in this question of the Israeli-Palestinian rapport? Have you come across that at all? Thank you.
Let's take, we're kind of out of time, so let's just take one more from up front here. Veronica,
Thank you. Benjamin Tour, retired U.S. Foreign Service officer. You referred to the situation of Jews in Venezuela, but Venezuela was one of the countries where your chart of figures showed a slight increase in the Jewish population between 1970 and 2000, or maybe. So I wonder if you could say something more about Jews in Venezuela.
I don't comment.
Okay, well, the last one, I mean, I think that the main reason, you know, we took the figures from De La Pergola, right, the 12,000. So it may have been correct in 1970, but then by the time that Chavez came to power, which is, say, 2000, there were 20,000 Jews. 20,000 Jews. And that is a figure that I think is very reliable. It comes from many sources, and we don't have, you may be right that we'll have to revise that and see what happened in the year 2000 in Venezuela, because there is a, now there are close to 10,000, 9,000, you see, 9,000. So there is definitely an exodus. And by the way, young people come to Israel still, also because it's very cheap to study in Israel, and especially you get scholarships and fellowships if you are a Jew. But the exodus is tremendous. It's tremendous. It has to do, affected economically as other middle class or upper middle class, be it has to do with anti-Semitism, that it's there. I mean, some of the stories about getting into the Jewish club, the Hebraica, and saying that maybe there were drugs or weapons, things that are totally scary when it comes. I mean, there is definitely, and some is controlled by Chavez, and others is just Chavez supporters that are more wild than he is on these issues. So it's a scary situation, plus crime, and kidnappings and other stuff. Crime is the highest, and they are very urban in Caracas and so on. So I think the figure, thanks for bringing it to our attention, it may have been correct in 1970. There are many Israelis also, by the way, that came to live in, we don't even talk about the expatriates, who will be the Israelis as compared with the Jews, that are in large numbers in the U.S. They are not in large numbers in Latin America, but in places like Panama or Venezuela, they were getting into numbers. But I think this is not so much the case. All right. When it comes to Carola's question, Dr. Wild's question, I don't really have much first-hand knowledge, nor do I have a pre-prepared answer. So since we know each other, I'll keep thinking and then give you a better answer later, but not to avoid the issue altogether. I would say, firstly, the isolation of Israel in Europe is very much similar to the isolation in Latin America. And the position of the left in Europe is very similar to the position of the left in Latin America. So that is definitely, the U.S. has less influence in Latin America when it comes to the Israeli issue than Europe now. So, it has to do with, I'm talking about the Palestinian issue, basically. And the role of, we have in Spain, for instance, quite a large number of Jews from Latin America. I don't know about other countries, Homeland and so on, you probably have. Most of them became exiled at the time of the military junta in Argentina, and they just escaped many of them escaped to Israel, and from Israel went to Spain. But there is quite with Judge Garzón, who considered the Jewish dimension of repression in Argentina to be a genocide. It has a lot to do with the lobbying of the Jews from Latin America in Spain. I was invited to Judge Garzón as well, and I saw the COSOFAM, the Comisión de Familiares, the Judíos Desaparecidos. There's been, on that level, there's been quite some action. When it comes to Israel, whether the Jews, I don't know that there are that many and they are so involved. Many of the Jews whom I see in Europe are kind of assimilated and more left-wing than Zionists. I may be wrong, but that's my guess altogether.
Okay. Eddie, we could probably go on for a long time, but it is time to end. I want to thank you for a wonderful presentation. Thank your research assistants for their diligent work.